Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story centered around the names that once shook all of history. Queen Elizabeth I, who carried the radiant glow of the Golden Age, and Mary Stuart, the cousin, who was both a looming shadow and the deepest haunting of her life. A story that isn't just about power or world-shaping decisions, but about loneliness, fear, and the final moment when a queen must face the true face she spent decades hiding. Tonight, we're opening the door to the backstage of the Tudor court, where the glittering portraits were only a shell, and the truth lived in the fragile moments history loved to avert its eyes from. This is not a replica of any story you've heard, but a new journey. Slower, deeper, and reaching into the shadows people rarely mention when they speak of an immortal queen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy reading those little details before diving into a new story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Behind the radiant portraits that painted Elizabeth I, with porcelain skin, unwavering eyes, and a jaw set in eternal defiance, there was a body slowly collapsing under the weight of years. For her entire life, she commanded her painters to keep her young, immaculate, untouchable. She controlled every angle, every brushstroke, every illusion. Portraits could lie. They always had. But death, quiet and patient, does not. On the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, when Elizabeth released her final breath inside Richmond Palace, every layer of artifice she had built around herself began to crumble. The powders, the silks, the jewels, the myth, all of it dissolved in an instant. There was no more court to impress, no more ambassadors to intimidate, no more subjects to enchant with the image of the Virgin Queen. What remained was only the truth of a woman at the end of her strength. Only a few hours after her passing, craftsmen were summoned for a task they knew well, though it never stopped chilling the spine: the taking of a death mask. Buckets of plaster were prepared, the mixture cool and heavy in their hands. They approached her with the caution one uses in the presence of something sacred, and yet the act itself was merciless. Wet plaster was pressed over the Queen's face, sealing itself against the cooling skin, sinking into every ridge and shadow, embracing each detail that life had softened or concealed. There were no flattering angles now, no soft lighting, no loyal painter standing nearby to erase a wrinkle or refine the lines of her mouth. Death allows no vanity. The plaster hardened slowly, minute by minute, as the craftsman stood in respectful silence, watching the final image of a reign take shape beneath a shell of chalky white. When the mold was finally lifted, the room fell into a hush deeper than before. Because there, resting inside the hollow of the cast, was the face Elizabeth had never allowed the world to see. The face time had carved without permission. The face of a woman worn down by decades of fear, command, loss, and unrelenting vigilance. Her eyes, once so sharp they seemed to pierce every lie spoken in her presence, had sunk back into the skull, leaving dark hollows that suggested a lifetime of sleepless nights. The wrinkles no painter dared record now formed stark, unbroken paths across her cheeks and forehead. Her lips, once carefully shaped with vermilion, hung slightly open, as though even in death she was still reaching for one more breath, the breath that would never come. It was the face of someone exhausted not only by the battles she fought against foreign powers, but by the quieter, crueler battles she fought against herself. A woman who had spent years standing upright, even as her heart cracked under the weight of decisions she could never take back. A woman who painted herself in eternal youth, because she knew that time was the one enemy she would never defeat. From that cold, unblinking mask, the story begins to turn backward, peeling away the years like layers of old lacquer. Because to understand how Elizabeth reached this final, hollow stillness, how a queen who once terrified Spain, who symbolized an age of triumph, culture, and glory, he could end her life in such profound solitude, we have to return to the choices that shaped her reign, to the fears she hid beneath powdered skin, to the ghosts she carried within her ribs, to the memories she never spoke aloud. Her death mask did more than record a moment. It revealed a truth no portrait ever dared touch: that beneath the crown, beneath the ceremony, beneath the image carved into history textbooks, was a woman whose brilliance and loneliness had grown side by side. A woman who had spent nearly half a century holding England together with the force of her will, only to fade away in a quiet chamber, surrounded not by courtiers or admirers, but by shadows of the dead who had walked beside her in life. And so, from that fragile, disquieting imprint of her final face, the question rises like a whisper in the dark. How did a queen who shaped an era end it so utterly alone? To understand why Elizabeth's final face carried such sorrow, we have to step into the last years of her life, years in which her public brilliance still shone like burnished gold. But inside, every anchor she had ever relied on was loosening, quietly, one by one. For most of her reign, Elizabeth was never truly alone. She lived surrounded by people, by courtiers, by ceremony, but also by a small circle of figures who saw her not as a monarch, but as a human being. Among them were Blanche Parry, who had walked beside her since the days when Elizabeth was a suspicious princess with an uncertain future, and William Cecil, the advisor who had carried the weight of the kingdom beside her from the earliest years of her rule. They were the ones who saw Elizabeth without a crown on her head, without the powder on her face, without the performance she wore so often that it had become part of her skin. They saw her hesitation, her exhaustion, her laughter when the court was not looking, her fear when the political winds shifted. They knew the woman beneath the myth. But in the year 1590, Blanche Parry died. It was the first tear in the invisible fabric holding Elizabeth upright. Perhaps she did not cry publicly. Monarchs rarely did. But something fragile inside her gave way. The palace remained full of voices, music, footsteps, silk rustling along stone floors. But the space Blanche once occupied became a silent, heavy pocket of air. It lingered the way dust lingers on old tapestries, unnoticed by those passing through, but impossible to brush away by those who live with it. 8 years later, in the year 1598, William Cecil died as well. If Blanche's death loosened the threads around Elizabeth's heart, Cecil's death tore the threads completely. He had been the constant beside her, the advisor who dared tell her no, the statesman who steadied England through storms foreign and domestic. Without him, the architecture of her daily life shifted. The corridors he used to walk suddenly held a different echo. People noticed the Queen pausing near corners where Cecil once appeared with papers in his hands, almost as if she expected him to turn the bend and offer counsel as he had done for decades. Her pace through the palace grew slower. Her eyes, once sharp enough to silence an entire room, now drifted into distance, as though she were listening for footsteps that would never return. Members of the court, accustomed to the Queen's fiery wit, began noticing the quiet growing around her, a quiet that seemed to hang in the very air she breathed. The court itself remained loud with ritual, with music, with politics. But around Elizabeth, silence began to pool like water in the crevices of an old stone floor. She withdrew from banquets. She delayed audiences. She turned away from performances she once enjoyed. The great public machine of monarchy continued, but its heartbeat, the Queen at its centre, was slowing, dimming, shrinking inward. She spent more hours tucked away in rooms where the curtains stayed drawn. The scent inside was always the same: old incense, smoke from a fire that had burned down to embers, and the faint, melancholy trace of something fading. Her ladies brought in flowers, hoping the scent of something fresh might brighten her spirits, but even their softness could not change the heaviness that clung to the chambers. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her world began to contract. The palace, once a stage on which she commanded every scene, became a labyrinth of memories rather than power. Each hallway reminded her of someone gone. Each empty chair whispered a name she would never hear spoken aloud again. Her reign, for decades so radiant, began folding in on itself, the way twilight folds over a landscape at the end of day, quietly, gently, but unmistakably. This was the turning point, the moment when the story shifted. The Queen, who once dazzled all of Europe, was now a woman walking through corridors filled not with courtiers, but with absences. A ruler who had stood unshaken through wars, plots, and betrayals was now being undone not by enemies, but by time. And in those final years, the vast sweep of the Tudor dynasty narrowed into something much smaller. The quiet, fragile pulse of a woman who had lived too long in the glare of power, and who now found herself standing in the long shadow of her own loneliness. When the familiar voices around her faded, and the companions of her earlier years vanished one by one, the knights began to speak in their place. And at the very centre of that quiet, growing darkness in Elizabeth's mind, stood a single name: Mary Stuart. She had been many things across Elizabeth's long life: a rival princess whose beauty stirred courts across Europe, a Queen of Scotland whose claim to the English throne once threatened to divide the kingdom, a prisoner who spent nearly 2 decades confined under Elizabeth's authority, and finally a woman who walked to the scaffold because of a warrant bearing Elizabeth's own signature. It was a signature, Elizabeth later insisted, had been misunderstood, mismanaged, even mishandled by her secretary. But the truth was something she could never outrun. Not with power, not with prayer, not even with time. In the soft crumbling of her final years, Mary returned to her not as a memory, but as a presence, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully banish. Elizabeth wept when Mary's name was mentioned. She dreamed of Mary. And sometimes, in moments when her ladies believed she was simply tired, she whispered that she had seen Mary standing in her chamber, dressed in the dark, heavy velvet the Scottish Queen favoured during her captivity, gazing at her with the calm, unreadable eyes of a woman who had already faced her own death. She did not admit these visions aloud at first. Queens were not meant to speak of ghosts, but her attendants noticed the signs regardless. The way her breath caught when a shadow shifted near the doorway, the sudden, sharp turn of her head toward an empty corner of the room, the trembling of her hands each time the name Mary floated into a conversation. They saw her depth of stillness on long winter nights, when the fire shrank into faint red coals and the edges of the room dissolved into shadow. She would sit awake long after the palace slept, her fingernail tracing the curve of her lower lip, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the reach of candlelight, as though watching someone step forward from the darkness. There were nights when a lady in waiting, passing softly through the chamber, overheard Elizabeth murmur into the quiet, "I did not mean it. I did not want that to happen." They were the same defences she had given to her council decades earlier, but now they carried none of the sharp edge of monarchic authority. These were not public declarations crafted to shield her reign. These were confessions for an audience of one, a woman who would never hear them. In the shrinking world of her final months, the battle Elizabeth found herself fighting was no longer against Spain, no longer against plots whispered in taverns or foreign courts, no longer against papal decrees or rebellious nobles. The battlefield lay within, in the memories she had buried beneath layers of politics and necessity. Mary Stuart was no longer a political adversary in those memories. She had become something heavier, more intimate, the embodiment of Elizabeth's lifelong fear that every choice she had made to secure the throne had cost her something of her own humanity. The nights pressed close in the dimming rooms of Richmond Palace. Wind brushed the windows like a hesitant hand. The tapestries along the walls seemed darker than before, their woven patterns sinking into the dusk. And Elizabeth, wrapped in her velvet robes, her hair thinning and her skin paling beneath the layers of powder, looked smaller than she ever had. Her strength, once sharp enough to command armies, had softened into something fragile and unguarded. She thought often of the moments leading to Mary's execution on the 8th day of February in the year 1587. She remembered the hesitation of her quill, the weight in her chest as she pressed her seal to the order, the dread that followed immediately after. The weeks of turmoil, the performance of outrage, how she had blamed her secretary, how she had struck him, how she had sworn she had never meant to destroy a queen. The public accepted the drama, but Elizabeth herself never did. Somewhere deep within, she knew she had woven the circumstances that left Mary with no path but death. Age did not erase that knowledge. It sharpened it. And in the soft collapse of those final years, Mary's silhouette trailed Elizabeth like a lengthening shadow. When Elizabeth closed her eyes, she saw the Scottish Queen walking toward the block with a serenity Elizabeth had never possessed. When she opened them, she felt as though Mary lingered just beyond the reach of waking. In that fading winter of her life, Elizabeth understood something she had never allowed herself to speak aloud. Mary Stuart was not haunting her out of vengeance. She was haunting her out of truth. And that truth, unavoidable, unsoftened, became the final judgment Elizabeth could not escape. The body always moves ahead of the crown, sounding the quiet alarm long before the mind dares to acknowledge it. And for Elizabeth, that alarm began as a soft unravelling, slow, stubborn, almost defiant. She refused her meals first, pushing away the great dishes set before her with a faint shake of the head. Then she turned from wine, claiming it was too heavy. Soon even the light broths and delicate morsels her ladies coaxed her to try were dismissed with a distant murmur. She was not hungry, She needed to think. She would eat later. But later kept slipping further away, until it became clear she was withdrawing from the world, one small refusal at a time. Each untouched plate marked another inch of retreat. The strength that had carried her through decades of rule began to ebb. Her hands trembled when she lifted a cup. Her steps grew unsteady, and she reached more often for the back of a chair or the carved edge of a table to steady herself. Yet the weaker her body became, the more fiercely she clung to the last realm, where she still felt control. Her posture. She would not lie down, not even for a moment. She sat upright in her chair, or stood gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles whitened, her eyes fixed ahead as though she were the lone sentinel guarding the final breach. It was not pride in the way the court had once known, it was fear, ancient and unspoken. She believed that the instant she allowed herself to lie flat, she would be surrendering to death itself. And Elizabeth had never surrendered to anyone, not even to time. Her ladies begged her gently. Servants knelt at her feet, voice hushed with panic. Physicians were summoned, and each time they approached, she dismissed them before they could even place a hand on her wrist. She refused examinations, refused remedies, refused to let anyone speak aloud what her weakening pulse already whispered. She knew her body was failing. She simply refused to hear the confirmation. It was as though she hoped that by denying the truth, she could delay it. But denial cannot fortify a body worn thin by so many winters. Each day, her figure diminished within the luxurious fabrics she still insisted upon wearing. The silks, velvets, and embroidered layers draped around her seemed heavier than before, almost swallowing her. The crown, once perfectly balanced atop her composure, now felt metaphorically enormous, too large for the slight woman shrinking beneath its legacy. She seemed to fold inward little by little, becoming almost spectral in her quiet corridors. The palace, which had once echoed with her energy, adjusted to this new, fragile rhythm. People began to move more softly around her. Doors were closed with care. Conversations tapered into whispers. Those who glimpsed her walking slowly from one chamber to another felt a strange ache, as though they were witnessing a powerful flame dim, but refusing to fall into darkness. The image of Elizabeth seated stiffly in her chair, eyes drifting far beyond the room, chest rising in shallow breaths, became the new portrait of the Queen. The commanding force she had once been lingered only as a faint outline around her, like the afterglow of a candle nearly burned out. She insisted on standing when she could, even when her legs trembled beneath the weight of her own body. Her ladies often hovered beside her with outstretched hands, prepared to catch her should her knees buckle. But Elizabeth shook her head at their offers, lifting her chin with the same stubborn pride she had shown in her youth. To sit was tolerable, to lean was acceptable, but to lie down, to surrender her height, her posture, her vigilance, that was unthinkable. It would be, in her mind, an admission that the final chapter had arrived. She grew quieter as the days passed. Her sentences shortened, and sometimes she answered questions with only a faint motion of her eyes. Her breath, once steady and strong, now came in thin, measured threads. Each inhalation seemed to require concentration, and each exhalation carried a softness that made her attendants hold their own breath in worry. She had become untethered from the vibrant world she once commanded so effortlessly. Still, she resisted. Every hour spent upright was an act of will, a final stand against an ending she was not ready to accept. Her world narrowed to the chair beneath her, the armrests beneath her fingers, and the small radius her eyes could wander. The palace looked at her with pity, but also with awe. Even in her frailty, Elizabeth refused to yield. She had become a figure carved out of exhaustion and determination, a queen still fighting not for land or power, but simply for one more moment of life lived on her own terms. And so the palace adapted. The great halls fell quieter. The laughter of courtiers dimmed. The music of celebrations ceased. Around her, the immense machinery of monarchy slowed to the rhythm of her failing breath. The dignity of her bearing, though, now only a fragment of what it once had been, hovered like a fading crown above her, suspended over a body, gradually withdrawing from the world it had once ruled so fiercely. But no body can defy its own limits forever. One night, in the dimming glow of the fire, Elizabeth tried to adjust herself in the chair that had become her final fortress. It was a small movement, barely more than a shift of weight, but her strength betrayed her. Her legs buckled. Her slight frame, now little more than fabric, bones, and stubborn breath collapsed forward. Her ladies gasped, and rushed toward her, their hands trembling as they caught the Queen who had once held an entire era in her voice. For a moment, they felt almost nothing in their arms. She was so light, so frighteningly insubstantial, as though her body had already begun slipping away from the world that still clung to her name. And in that fragile, suspended instant, Elizabeth understood what everyone around her had known for weeks. Her will could no longer drag her body forward. The force that had shaped the fate of nations had thinned into something faint, fluttering, and nearly gone. Yet even then, even with her knees folded beneath her and her breath unsteady, she resisted the hands trying to guide her toward the bed. Her fingers clung to the carved armrest, to sleeves, to anything within reach, not with the proud defiance of a monarch, but with the terrified instinct of someone who feared losing the last sliver of control she still possessed. Sitting meant vigilance. Sitting meant life. Lying down meant surrender. Her ladies whispered her name, their voices soft and pleading. They tried to soothe her with promises of comfort, their palms warm against her chilled skin. But Elizabeth shook her head weakly, her eyes wide and unfocused, the fear inside them raw and childlike. The world around her had narrowed to a small circle of firelight, shadows, and faces she no longer fully recognized. And into that dimness, she began calling out names that belonged to a different time, names of those who had already crossed the threshold she was now approaching. Blanche, she murmured, voice thin as thread. Cecil, Henriette, Kate. The sound of those names rippled through the room like a faint draught. Her attendants froze, understanding the weight of what they were hearing. Elizabeth was not calling for advisors or officers. She was calling for the dead, summoning the pieces of her past as though they were waiting in the next chamber, ready to walk in if only she called with enough longing. Her whispers were not coherent sentences now, only fragments, words slipping from her lips in soft, broken strands. But her ladies understood. They were witnessing something no court chronicler would ever record. A woman moving gently, painfully around the entire circumference of her life. One last time. The Queen had governed Europe's stage. The woman beneath the crown was now wandering through memory, searching for those she had loved, lost, or wronged. The moment came slowly, but inevitably. Her attendants, their hands shaking with worry, approached her again, but this time with nothing forceful, nothing commanding. Only quiet murmurs, soft touches, a hand brushing her hair back, another resting lightly on her arm. They spoke to her with the tenderness reserved not for royalty, but for someone slipping toward the edge of a dream. And something inside her loosened. The resistance that had held her upright for so long melted into confusion, then into a weary acceptance. Her fingers, once curled around the armrest, slipped free. Her shoulders lost their tension. Her legs, trembling beyond control, no longer tried to hold her. She sagged gently into the arms supporting her, her head lowering as though it had finally grown too heavy for her neck to bear. Her ladies carried her carefully, terrified she might shatter in their grasp. Her body, once wrapped in the armor of ceremony, now felt weightless, vulnerable, and painfully human. When they laid her onto the bed she had avoided for so many nights, her body sank into the pillows, as though it had been waiting for this moment, resisting only out of fear, never readiness. A soft exhale slipped from her lips. Not dramatic, not drawn out, just a quiet, trembling breath that sounded like a thread, finally releasing tension after being pulled too tight for far too long. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers relaxed, and for the first time in many days, her body was no longer braced against the world. That gentle breath carried the story across a threshold. Elizabeth was no longer the Queen battling death with clenched fists and unyielding posture. She was a woman exhausted, unraveling, sinking into the dimness that had been gathering around her for months. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The palace felt it. Her ladies felt it. And somewhere deep within, perhaps Elizabeth felt it too. The end of resistance, and the beginning of surrender to the darkness she had spent her life refusing to name. When Elizabeth finally lay down, the palace seemed to hold its breath with her. But the rest her ladies hoped for did not come. She lay there, small and fragile beneath the gold-embroidered blankets that had once symbolized triumph, her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling as though she was still searching for a sign, a message, something she needed to understand before time slipped through her fingers. Her breath was faint, shallow, each inhale catching in her chest as if the air itself struggled to enter. The rise and fall of her body was so slight that her ladies leaned closer, terrified they might miss the moment it stopped altogether. They knelt around her bed, their hands folded, their voices lowered to whispers that never fully formed into words. No one dared cry out loud. No one dared disturb the thin thread keeping her tethered to the world. From time to time, one of them reached to touch her hand, their fingertips brushing gently against her trembling skin, as though offering steadiness through the small storms of shivers that passed through her limbs. The night deepened, thickening like velvet around the bed. And within that darkness, Elizabeth began to murmur in broken pieces. There were apologies, soft, unfinished, drifting away before anyone could grasp whom they were meant for. There were questions asked over and over, about the light, about the morning. "Is it dawn yet?" she whispered once, even though the curtains had been tightly drawn for many days. Her voice came out thin and cracked, like an old thread pulled too tightly. The question was not about sunrise. It was about whether the world she knew was ending. Her moments of clarity came in fragile flashes. She would blink slowly, her gaze sharpening for only a heartbeat, as if she recognized the room, the faces around her, the life she still held on to. Then she slipped back into a restless drifting, her attention sliding to some distant place only she could see. It was impossible to tell whether she was here, in Richmond Palace, or walking down the long corridors of memory she had not visited in years. Every time the candle flames trembled, she turned her head toward the shadows, her eyes widening slightly, searching the corners of the room where the light did not reach. Her ladies followed her gaze, but saw only darkness. They did not need to ask. They knew who she was waiting for. Mary Stuart. The name was never spoken aloud in those hours, but it hovered in the air like a cold draught sliding under a door. Mary did not appear as terror anymore, not as accusation, not as the spectre of a death warrant signed on a winter day in the year 1587. No, Mary's presence had changed. The sharp fear that once gripped Elizabeth whenever she sensed that familiar silhouette had softened into something stranger, something almost tender. As the hours passed, Elizabeth no longer startled at the thought of Mary. She no longer flinched at shadows. Instead, a peculiar expectancy settled into her gaze. She seemed to wait, breathing shallowly, eyelids fluttering, as though Mary's presence was not a haunting but a kind of long-delayed answer. The exhaustion in her face did not erase the faint calm gathering around her features, a stillness that hinted at surrender. The bed beneath her was no longer a place of rest. It had become a boundary thin, trembling between two Elizabeths. One was the Queen, the last Tudor monarch, who had held Spain at bay, shaped England's golden age, commanded armies and courtiers with a lift of her chin. The other was simply a woman, worn down by years of solitude, grief, and guilt, lying on her back, waiting for the world she had built to release her. Her ladies saw the shift. They recognized the moment when she crossed from resistance into acceptance. Her fingers, once curled tensely around the sheets, loosened. Her shoulders softened. Her breathing slowed into a fragile rhythm that matched the flicker of the candles. The grand persona she had worn so carefully all her life slipped away, dissolving into the dim light. Elizabeth no longer clung to the world with the fierce determination that had defined her. She simply gazed upward, waiting. And in that waiting, between the rise and fall of each fading breath, the palace felt itself suspended between two realms. The Queen, who had ruled for more than 4 decades, lay still, hovering at the threshold. The woman beneath the crown, weary from a lifetime of battles fought in public and in secret, was preparing quietly to let go. The bed, once avoided with terror, became the final stage upon which her last transformation unfolded. From sovereign to soul, from ruler to memory, from a woman who clung fiercely to life, to one who was finally, slowly, allowing the darkness to draw near. Time inside the Queen's bedchamber began to separate itself from the world beyond its walls. Hours were no longer marked by church bells echoing across the Thames, nor by the measured footsteps of guards on their nightly rounds. Instead, time was counted by the slow thinning of Elizabeth's breath, by the faint flutter of her eyelids, by the uneven pauses that stretched between one inhale and the next. She drifted into a state suspended between waking and dream, a soft fog where memory and present blended until neither could be distinguished from the other. The ceiling above her ceased to be plaster and beams. It became a mirror reflecting all the unfinished sentences of her life. Sometimes she stared at it so long that her ladies wondered if she truly saw the room at all, or if she was reading the story of her life, written in shadows only she could see. When a lady whispered her name, it took a few slow, wandering seconds before Elizabeth responded. Her eyes would blink once, twice, as though she were returning from a great distance, and then she would offer the faintest nod. Words took too much strength. Even turning her head required effort. Every movement she made was fragile, deliberate, like a candle flame trying not to go out. Her ladies tried to find the woman she had once been, the Queen who had stood before Parliament, declaring, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." But the figure lying beneath layers of embroidered blankets was no longer that iron monarch. Time had worn her down, softened her edges, thinned her voice, hollowed her gaze. When exhaustion washed over her, she turned her head slightly, her eyes drifting toward the darkened corners of the room. It was a slow, graceful motion, as though she were acknowledging a presence rather than searching for one. There was no fear in her expression now, no startle, no trembling. There was only a quiet recognition, a soft acceptance. She knew the darkness was calling to her. And in that gathering shadow, memories began to take shape, faces rising out of the dimness like pale reflections on a midnight lake. Her mother, her father, they appeared not as ghosts of dread, but as distant, softened recollections woven with longing. Her beloved counsellors, William Cecil, Blanche Parry, Robert Dudley, returned in the haze, not as courtiers, but as the people who had carried her through a lifetime of burden. And others too, those she had outlived, those she had buried in silence, those she had once relied on more than she ever admitted. One by one, she whispered their names in a voice so worn, it barely rose above breath. When she said "Mother," there was a tremor of wonder. When she said "Father," it was almost a plea. The names were not commands. They were not orders sent from a throne. They were the quiet calls of a woman trying to gather the scattered pieces of her own life before they slipped beyond her reach. Every whispered name felt like a thread she did not want to lose. The palace around her sensed this shift, this thinning of the barrier between the Queen's body and the inevitable silence approaching her. Doors began to close more gently. Servants moved with reverent slowness. Their footsteps softened as though the stone floors themselves were holding their breath. Even conversations in distant halls quieted, falling into hushed tones that seemed to carry the awareness of her dwindling strength. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the windowpanes, but even the gusts seemed softened, as though the world itself understood it should not intrude. The candles burned lower, their flames trembling but steady, casting long shadows that seemed to wrap themselves around the room in a kind of protective stillness. The very air grew tender, careful, respectful, aware that a queen was not simply dying, but departing at her own rhythm, a rhythm too delicate to disturb. Elizabeth lay there, suspended between worlds, no longer clinging to power, no longer fighting the inevitable. Her breaths came fragile, shallow, each one carrying the weight of a life that had stretched across triumphs, wars, betrayals, victories, and wounds time had never fully healed. Yet in her final hours, what remained was not the crown, nor the empire, nor the legacy. What remained was only the quiet gathering of memories, faces, voices, moments returning to accompany her on the last stretch of the path. The palace exhaled softly around her as she lay on that threshold, a queen fading out of history, and a woman preparing to leave the world with the same solemn grace she had lived within it. Outside the chamber, England continued to move with all the ceremonies of a mighty kingdom. Courtiers exchanged anxious glances in shadowed corridors, ambassadors whispered about succession, and clergymen waited with folded hands, ready to recite the final prayers the moment they were summoned. But inside the Queen's room, the vast machinery of empire shrank into a single, fragile circle: the bed, the candlelight, and the thinning breath of Elizabeth. Nothing else existed, nothing else mattered. The world that had once bent beneath her command now hung, suspended around her, in a silence so delicate it seemed afraid to touch her. The murmurs of statesmen drifted faintly from beyond the door, half-formed discussions about the Scottish king, the necessary oaths, the documents that would need sealing the instant the last Tudor monarch exhaled her final breath. But Elizabeth did not hear them. The only presence she reached for now belonged to someone who no longer belonged to the living: Mary. The closer Elizabeth moved toward the edge of life, the more her gaze settled on the same darkened corner of the room, the place she believed Mary stood. There was no tremor in her eyes anymore, no tightening of her mouth, no desperate attempt to look away. In her youth and middle age, the name Mary Stuart had been a storm shadow stretching along the horizon. Threat, guilt, fear, rivalry, destiny. But here, in the quiet hours before dawn, that shadow softened. It became a shape she did not resist, a shape she almost welcomed. Her lips parted around Mary's name as though speaking to an old companion, not an executed queen, whose death warrant had borne Elizabeth's own signature on the 8th day of February, in the year 1587. Her whisper was frayed, barely audible, but unmistakably tender. A greeting, a reaching, perhaps even a reconciliation. Mary had been the ghost of her guilt for so many years. Now, in the dimming light, she became a strange kind of comfort, a final, familiar face waiting on the threshold. Elizabeth's breathing shifted again, taking on the rhythm of distant waves, rising, falling, each time weaker than the last. Her chest lifted only slightly, as if reluctant to disturb the blankets. Her skin grew thin as parchment. When the candles flickered, the light seemed to pass through her, illuminating the fragile architecture of bone beneath her cheeks. She looked translucent, as if the world were already beginning to see through her. Her ladies never left her side. They hovered like quiet sentinels, their silhouettes reflected in the soft golden candlelight. One held Elizabeth's hand, rubbing life into fingers that had turned cold. Another dabbed the fine beads of sweat collecting at her temple. A third whispered prayers, gentle, steady, rhythmic, carrying the words Elizabeth could no longer form. They had attended her for decades, but never had their duties been this intimate, this sacred, this unbearably tender. And still, beneath the rustling of blankets and the wavering glow of candles, the ladies heard her murmurs. Half-words, apologies, names, small pieces of prayer, the fragments of a lifetime unravelling. Her voice was barely there, a scattering of threads drifting into the air. Forgive. I did not. Mother. Mary. They leaned closer, catching the meaning even when the words failed. Those whispers were the last threads tying Elizabeth to the world, the final strands of the tapestry she had woven through 44 years on the throne. But each thread loosened in turn. Her voice weakened, her breath shortened, her fingers slipped from the hands holding hers. And the silence grew thicker, so thick it felt like a presence, a living thing settling into the room. The unravelling of a dynasty does not arrive with thunder. It does not roar through palaces or shake the earth. Sometimes it comes like this, a soft, devastating quiet. A silence so complete that even the smallest falter in breath makes every person in the room flinch. The ladies watched the rise and fall of her chest with a reverence that bordered on fear. Every shallow inhale felt like a borrowed moment. Every exhale felt like it might be the last. The entire palace, though still bustling beyond the walls, felt balanced on the fragile edge of those breaths. Elizabeth lay still, her eyes half open, her gaze drifting not toward her ladies, not toward her crown, not toward the world she would soon leave behind, but toward that shadowed corner where she believed Mary waited. The candles hissed softly. The night pressed close, and the silence continued to grow, as though preparing to swallow the final breath of a queen and the final echo of a dynasty, all in the same delicate moment. There came a moment when everyone in the room felt it. Elizabeth was about to leave them. No one spoke the words aloud, but the air itself carried the knowledge. Her breathing, once uneven and fragile, lengthened into slow, distant waves, each inhale thin and trembling, each exhale softer than the last. It was the kind of breathing that belonged not to the living world, but to the edge of something beyond it. Each time her chest lifted even slightly, her ladies froze, watching, waiting, wondering if it would rise again, or if that had been the final time. They knelt beside her bed, hands intertwined with hers, holding the cold fingers that had once carried a scepter, once signed treaties, once steadied an entire kingdom. Tears slid down their cheeks, but no one allowed herself the luxury of sobbing. This silence was sacred. This silence was hers. The women who addressed her, guarded her secrets, and stood by her through the long decline, now held their breath in unison, trying not to disturb the thin thread of life still clinging to her body. Then, unexpectedly, Elizabeth opened her eyes, slowly, heavily, as if the effort required peeling back the weight of an entire lifetime. Her gaze moved across their faces, not with the commanding sharpness of the queen they had once served, but with the softness of a woman who had endured too much for too long. There was no crown in that look, no throne, no nation, only years, decades of them. Years filled with triumph and terror, devotion and betrayal, love and loss. A lifetime spent carrying burdens no one else could have survived, now distilled into a single, exhausted expression. And then she smiled. It was the smallest smile imaginable, so small it barely lifted the corner of her mouth, more a tremor than a gesture. But it was real, gentle, human, a flicker of peace passing over features carved by time and grief. Her lips parted, and in a voice that had once addressed armies and parliaments, she whispered only 3 words. "I'm tired." Just that. 3 simple syllables, but inside them lay everything she had never allowed herself to say. The weight of the crown she could never take off. The nights she had stood vigil over her own fears. The choices that still echoed through her conscience. The loneliness that no court full of admirers had ever soothed. Those 3 words held it all: the surrender she had denied, the truth she had never spoken, the humanity she had hidden beneath silk and armor. The fire in the hearth dwindled into a faint bed of glowing embers. The candles melted lower, their flames wavering in the stillness. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching softly across the floor, like arms preparing to gather her in. Elizabeth's breathing thinned even more, barely there, barely moving the blankets draped across her small frame. Then came the final breath. It did not arrive with drama. It did not wrench itself from her lungs. It slipped from her lips as gently as a sigh, light as a falling leaf, quiet as dust settling on stone. One faint rise of her chest, one trembling release, and then nothing. The silence that followed was so complete, so whole, that for a moment the ladies wondered if she had simply fallen asleep. No one could say with certainty the exact second her heart stopped beating. There was no gasp, no shudder, no cry. Her passing came like sunrise, soft, gradual, so subtle it nearly went unnoticed. A moment that slipped into existence without declaring itself, leaving those who witnessed it to realize only afterward that something enormous had ended. The truth seeped into the room slowly, like a cold draught creeping beneath a door. A shift in the air, a stillness too deep to be breath, a quiet that tightened the throat. One by one, her ladies lowered their heads, tears falling silently onto the blankets. Their hands, still gently holding hers, now held the hand of a woman who was no longer there. The entire room felt it like a great, invisible body trembling in grief. The hush deepened, heavy and reverent. Even the flames seemed to bend lower, as though bowing to the passing of the last Tudor monarch. Elizabeth, who had once held England in her grasp and shaped an age that bore her name, was gone. And in that vast, soul-deep silence, the world felt the shift the moment when a queen became a memory. After Elizabeth's death, the palace no longer felt like a place of order or ritual. It became a shrine, quiet, trembling, heavy with the presence of something that had just slipped away. Her ladies touched her hand one last time, their fingertips lingering on the cooling skin, as though trying to memorize the warmth before it faded completely. Someone gently closed her eyes, sliding her lids down with a tenderness that seemed to echo decades of hidden devotion. Someone whispered a prayer, soft, quivering, almost broken. Then, one by one, they left the room, their footsteps light and wavering, leaving the Queen's body to the men who had been summoned. Those men entered carrying a plaster mould, the object that would capture the final, unvarnished face of an entire era. A face stripped of powder, stripped of jewels, stripped of the painted youth she had commanded artists to preserve for more than 4 decades. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth's face belonged to no one's expectations. It belonged only to truth. They worked in silence. The plaster, cool and heavy, was pressed gently over her features. It settled into every hollow and curve over the sunken cheeks, over the deep creases carved by age and worry, over the faint lines at the corners of her mouth where exhaustion had lived for years. Her lips, once shaped into the practiced regal smile of a monarch, now rested slightly slack, marked by the weight of her final whisper. Her eyelids lay smooth, fragile as parchment. Her brow, once fierce enough to silence a council merely by lifting, now bore only the imprint of a long life carried with courage and strain. Layer by layer, the plaster embraced her. And when the mould was finally lifted, the room fell into a stillness so complete that even breath seemed hesitant. Inside the hollow shape lay the truth her portraits had concealed for decades. Elizabeth was not simply a legend, nor a symbol, nor an untouchable icon. She had been a human being, one who had endured too much, endured too long, and held more pain than she ever allowed the world to see. 3 weeks later, her body was carried to Whitehall, where thousands came to bid farewell. Men removed their hats, women knelt along the path, some bowed their heads, others wept openly. They came not only to honour a queen, but to mourn the end of a dynasty, the closing of the Tudor chapter that had shaped England for more than a century. The line that began with Henry VII ended with the woman lying in the coffin, draped in cloth of gold. And the death mask, the cold, honest mould taken in those first hours, became the foundation for the effigy at Westminster Abbey. Yet the sculptor, like history itself, softened what he saw. He smoothed the deep wrinkles, lifting from her stone face the burden of grief that had consumed her final years. He raised the corners of her lips ever so slightly, giving her a serenity she had rarely known in life. He shaped her into a queen the world could admire, not the exhausted woman who had whispered her surrender. People would come to Westminster Abbey and stare at that effigy, believing they were looking into the face of Elizabeth I. But beneath the polished stone, beneath the softened features and the graceful repose, the plaster truth still existed, the mask that did not lie. And beneath that truth lay something deeper still. The memory of the last woman of the Tudor line, who had carried a kingdom until her body could no longer stand, who had lived through shadows and triumphs, who had borne loneliness like armour, and who, in the end, spoke the truest words of her life. "I am tired." A whisper that extinguished the light of an age. A whisper that left the world behind her like a candle just blown out. Smoke rising softly, silently, into the air. News of the Queen's death spread through the kingdom, like the first cold wind of winter. Quiet, steady, undeniable. No one shouted, no one ran. Yet the truth moved on its own, slipping through corridors, drifting down staircases, brushing against stone walls as softly as a sigh. It seeped beneath doors and around corners, carrying with it a chill that made even seasoned courtiers straighten their backs and lower their eyes. Those who had spent their days debating policy, presenting petitions, and clashing in brilliant verbal duels now fell silent, as though their voices feared shattering the fragile sanctity of the moment. The palace felt different. Its grand chambers, usually alive with rustling silk and the rhythm of busy footsteps, now held a stillness that settled like dust over every surface. Servants walked as though their feet were made of glass. Guards stood stiffer at their posts. Even the tapestries seemed to hang more heavily, absorbing the weight of the news. Beyond the palace walls, in the churches that punctuated London's skyline, the bells began to toll. Not in alarm, not in triumph, but in slow, measured strokes, each one deep, steady, echoing like the heartbeat of a nation whose pulse had just faltered. The sound carried across the river, over markets and alleyways, through crowded squares and narrow streets. It reached homes where families paused mid-sentence, shops where hands froze over goods, and taverns where cups were lifted halfway to lips before lowering again. A mist of disbelief swept through London. People gathered in small groups on street corners, their breath visible in the cold morning air. "Is it true?" they whispered to one another, hope flickering desperately behind their eyes, only to dim again when the next bell sounded affirming, undeniable, a sorrow that could not be reasoned away. Faces fell, shoulders sank, men removed their hats, women pressed hands to their mouths. Children stared at the adults, sensing grief in its purest, wordless form. No one looked toward the palace as the seat of power anymore. That day, Whitehall was not a symbol of authority. It was the wounded heart of an entire nation. When Elizabeth's coffin was brought to Whitehall, the transformation became complete. The place that had once orchestrated the machinery of empire now stood as a sanctuary of mourning. Her body was placed beneath heavy cloth of gold, and for 3 full weeks the doors remained open to all nobles with rings on their fingers and velvet on their backs, and commoners with rough hands and threadbare cloaks. They entered in slow, reverent lines, their steps muffled on the stone floor. Some bowed deeply, some knelt and wept without restraint. Some stood motionless, tears filling their eyes, unable to speak. Every person who came understood they were not merely bidding farewell to a queen. They were saying goodbye to an entire age. The Golden Age. The age of bravery at sea and turmoil in courts. The age of poets who gave England a voice. And the age of shadows where secrets and betrayals coiled in silent corners. The age of victories that shook continents. And the age of losses Elizabeth never let the world see. They mourned not just a monarch but the end of a story that had shaped their world. The streets outside Whitehall, filled with black cloth and bowed heads. Merchants closed their stalls without being asked. Ships on the river lowered their flags. From Westminster to the Tower, London wrapped itself in a hush that felt almost sacred. People said the air itself weighed more that day. Mothers held their children closer. Old men wiped their eyes with trembling hands. Young women who had admired the Queen's resolve stood in silence, imagining the weight she had carried alone. Even those who had criticized her policies or questioned her choices found themselves subdued because her passing marked more than personal loss. It marked the end of a chapter England would never replicate. Elizabeth's death was not merely the departure of a sovereign, it was the closing of a massive, ornate door, a door leading back into an era that had already been slipping into memory long before she drew her final breath. But as long as she lived, the door had remained cracked open. Her presence alone had kept the Tudor world alive, flickering like a candle resisting the wind. Now, in the chill spreading through the city, that candle had finally gone out, and the people of England, gathered in quiet clusters beneath a sky that felt dimmer than the night before, understood what the bells were truly saying. Not just that their queen was gone, but that a whole century of triumphs, crises, brilliance, and blood had ended with her. The Tudors, whose shadows had stretched over England for more than 100 years, had become history. And London, silent, grieving, reverent, stood witness as the age folded itself closed. When Elizabeth was gone, the people who had served her most closely, the hands that had steadied her trembling fingers, the voices that had soothed her restless nights, the women who had carried her weight when her legs could no longer hold her, felt the silence stretch around them like a veil of black silk. They had grown accustomed to the rituals of her final days, adjusting her blankets, lifting her gently from the chair she refused to abandon, offering her warm broth she barely sipped, guiding her delicate hands when they shook too violently to lift a cup. These gestures had become their language, their purpose, their final way of loving a queen who had spent a lifetime hiding her vulnerabilities from the world. And then, in a single night, all of it vanished. The room remained exactly as it had been. The same heavy drapes, the same carved bedposts, the same soft pools of candlelight flickering across the stone walls. The air still carried the faint warmth of her last breaths, a ghostly reminder that she had been there only moments before. The blanket still held the memory of her shape. The cushions bore the indentation of her head. Even the chair at her bedside seemed to wait for the next time she might try to sit up, as she had always done, stubbornly clinging to the last fragments of authority her body allowed. But Elizabeth herself was gone. The absence was so total it felt like a second presence, quiet, looming, immense. None of her attendants dared touch anything. Not the folded handkerchiefs by the pillow, not the rosary she sometimes held but rarely prayed with, not the velvet cushions arranged just so beneath her shoulders. They did not open the windows, though dawn pressed softly against the glass. They did not pull back the curtains, though light waited patiently beyond them. They hardly even breathed, afraid that any movement might disturb the last trace of her existence the room still held. They feared, above all, that if they shifted the air too much, the final image of her face, peaceful, exhausted, impossibly fragile, would slip from their memories like mist. One of the younger ladies was the first to cry. She turned her face away, trying to hide the trembling of her shoulders, but the sound escaped her anyway, a small, aching sob. Someone else placed a hand on her back and broke down too. Soon the room filled with quiet weeping, soft, raw, real. Not the choreographed grief of a court in mourning, but the grief of women who had watched her fade breath by breath, who had witnessed every flicker of fear, every whispered apology, every stubborn refusal to surrender. One cried because she remembered the Queen's laughter in healthier years, a quick, sharp sound that seemed to surprise even Elizabeth herself. Another wept because she remembered the way Elizabeth had squeezed her hand during a moment of terror, gripping it so tightly that her fingers had gone numb. Another simply cried because she wished she could have done more, even though she knew nothing would have changed the outcome. They had not only lost a monarch, they had lost the woman they had called Your Majesty all their lives, yet had cared for with a tenderness that surpassed duty. They had washed her hair when she was too weak to lift her arms. They had changed her gowns when her body shrank beneath the weight of brocade. They had slept on the floor when she was afraid to be alone. They had heard her whispers in the dark, her doubts, her guilt, her longing for people who had died decades before. They knew her not as history would remember her, but as she truly was. A woman who had lived too long, carried too much, fought too hard. Now she was gone, and the emptiness she left behind expanded with every passing second. It pressed into the corners of the room, filled the spaces between breaths, settled over the floor like invisible dust. It reminded them that every life, no matter how crowned, how celebrated, how fiercely defended, eventually dissolves into the same silence. One of the older attendants, who had served Elizabeth since she was a young princess at Hatfield, laid a trembling hand on the foot of the bed. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "She has left us." Not with solemnity, not with ceremony, but with the quiet despair of someone who had lost a part of herself. The others nodded, unable to speak. In that still room, with candles flickering low and the world waiting outside the door, the truth settled over them like a shroud. The woman they had devoted their lives to was no longer there, and the silence she left behind was deeper, heavier, and more haunting than death itself. The craftsmen stepped into the chamber with a reverence usually reserved for sacred places. They had been summoned before dawn, when the palace was still wrapped in the muted grey of early morning, and the air carried that strange, hushed heaviness that follows a death. These men had performed this task for kings and queens before, but never had the weight of it pressed so hard upon their chests as it did now. They paused just inside the doorway, not out of hesitation, but out of something closer to awe, as though crossing the threshold meant stepping out of time and into the final breath of an age. They were not allowed to linger. There was work to be done, precise, unembellished, inevitable. In silence, they set down their tools, a basin, a wooden board, strips of cloth, and the bowl of plaster mixture cold, white, with a faint mineral scent that drifted into the room like winter air. Its chill seemed to spread outward, touching the tapestries, the stones, even the air beside the bed where Elizabeth lay. The cold did not matter to her anymore, but it mattered to those who approached her. It reminded them that this was no longer the queen they had once glimpsed from a distance. This was a body, a relic, the last vessel of a story that had taken nearly half a century to unfold. Moving with slow, deliberate care, they approached the bed. Elizabeth's face pale, sharp, and still rested against the linen pillows. Without the powder and the paint, without the careful lighting or flattering angles, without the defiant tilt of her chin that had commanded so many portraits, she seemed smaller, more human, more breakable. Her lips, slightly parted from the final breath she had released hours earlier, seemed frozen mid-sentence. Her closed eyelids held the delicate blue of fading veins. Her cheeks had collapsed inward, leaving the bones beneath stark and unmistakable. The men prepared the plaster. One stirred the mixture again, even though it no longer needed stirring just to keep his hands busy, to delay the moment. Another unrolled the linen strips. A third closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer that only he could hear. Then the work began. They dipped their hands into the cool mixture and lifted it, letting it fall in slow ribbons before pressing it carefully, reverently, onto the Queen's face. The sound of it settling into place was soft but unmistakable, a wet, gentle cling, as though the plaster itself understood the gravity of the moment. Every motion was measured, mindful. No one breathed too loudly. No one dared speak. The only sounds were the faint movements of their hands, the shifting fabric of their sleeves as they leaned forward, and the quiet pounding of their own hearts. The plaster spread over her forehead, her eyelids, her nose, her cheeks, her mouth. It recorded everything. The deep creases, carved by years of vigilance. The sharp lines of a jaw once held in unshakable pride. The sag of exhaustion at the corners of her lips. The imprint of a life that had demanded strength beyond what any single human should ever be asked to bear. This was no portrait commissioned to flatter, no idealized pattern of youth, no story shaped by politics. This was truth. When the plaster finally set, they touched the edges with trembling hands. Very slowly, they lifted it from her face. The sound of it releasing soft, deliberate, seemed almost like a breath. All of them leaned in, staring into the hollow shape that had captured her final expression. And in that silence, there was no mistaking what they saw. It was not the face that England had worshipped in paintings, the radiant skin, the severe beauty, the ageless facade, crafted for diplomacy and myth. It was the face of a woman stripped bare of all crowns, all performances, all defences. Her cheekbones jutted sharply, her lips drawn with fatigue, her brow lined with the weight of decisions that had altered the course of nations. One of the craftsmen turned quickly away, his throat tightening. Another swallowed hard. A third whispered, barely audible, "This is her, not the legend, not the icon, not the virgin queen the world insisted on remembering. This, a woman who had endured heartbreak, guilt, loneliness, and unending responsibility. A woman who had fought to keep her country intact. A woman who had hidden her humanity beneath layers of ritual, duty, and painted perfection. The death mask, cold, severe, unyieldingly honest, became the only record of the face Elizabeth never allowed the world to see. The face she had concealed behind powdered masks, behind silks and jewels, behind proclamations and strength. It was her final confession, one she could never speak aloud, one she could no longer deny, one that time itself would carry forward quiet, stark, and utterly truthful. Many years later, when the craftsmen finally set to work carving the monument for Queen Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey, they began exactly where tradition demanded, with the death mask. They studied its stark lines, its hollow contours, its unsoftened truth. It was their blueprint, the closest the world would ever come to seeing her as she truly was in those final hours. But what they did next was what history itself had always done for her: reshape the truth until it became gentler, smoother, easier to look at. They traced the deepest wrinkles with their chisels, then softened them, shaving away the grooves etched by decades of strain. They lifted the corners of her mouth just slightly, enough to suggest a serenity she had not possessed when she died. They shaved down the lines beneath her eyes, the shadows that had held 44 years of ruling, loss, fear, and vigilance. They smoothed the tension out of her brow, erasing the marks left by a lifetime of watching enemies move through shadow and allies shift like tides. Bit by bit, the stone version of Elizabeth emerged beautiful, regal, composed. Not the worn, exhausted woman who had whispered her last surrender, but a queen who seemed to have slipped peacefully into rest, untouched by regret or exhaustion. The effigy they created lay in eternal repose, hands folded, face serene, gown meticulously carved into elegant folds. She looked like the ideal of monarchy, untouched, unbroken, ageless, in a way no human life could ever be. But the real face, the honest one, still existed somewhere, stored in the quiet dark, where old artifacts are kept. The mask remained exactly as it had been the moment they lifted it from her cold skin. Severe, unembellished, unprotected by vanity or myth. It was a reminder that beneath the polished stone likeness worshipped by generations lay a truth far rougher and infinitely more human. It reminded anyone who cared to look closer that Elizabeth had not lived a life of easy grandeur. She had lived one of complexity, shaped by choices so heavy they left marks on her skin. She had loved in silence, carried guilt without confessing it, and ruled in a world that doubted a woman's strength at every turn. She had outlived almost everyone she had ever trusted: her mother, executed when Elizabeth was still a child; her father, who had taught her the price of favour and the danger of affection; Robert Dudley, whose death left a wound she never healed; William Cecil, whose absence hollowed her final years; Mary Stuart, whose execution haunted her even in dreams. The stone monument did not show that Elizabeth had cried for the friends she had buried. It did not show that she had regretted a death warrant signed in fear and politics. It did not show that she had refused to lie down in her final days, because she believed, deep down, that once she did, she would never rise again. History saw her through a distant lens, majestic, victorious, commanding. Stone made her serene. Portraits made her perfect. Myths made her untouchable. But the death mask told the truth. Underneath every layer of legend lay a woman who had been terrified of loneliness, who had fought for her crown with every ounce of strength she possessed, who had endured illnesses, betrayals, and the crushing weight of expectation. A woman who had walked through her palace, knowing it would one day outlive her. A woman who had stood taller than the men who doubted her, even when she was breaking inside. Visitors passing her monument in Westminster Abbey might pause in awe. They might see only the Queen, the last Tudor, the architect of England's golden age, the monarch who defied empires and survived conspiracies. They might marvel at the smooth stone, the calm features, the impression of eternal command. But just beneath that stone, beneath the centuries of solemn admiration, beneath the layers of myth and tribute, there still existed an Elizabeth no one bowed to, an Elizabeth no one painted, an Elizabeth no one crowned, a woman who had cried quietly when her friends died, a woman who had whispered apologies into the night, A woman who had feared sleep because she believed she might never awaken again. That was the part of Elizabeth's death kept for itself. The part history softened, but never erased. The part hidden beneath the marble, a truth waiting for anyone who cared enough to look beneath the legend. Elizabeth left behind a stronger England than the one she had inherited. The kingdom she took, as a young, uncertain woman, in the year 1558, was fractured by religious conflict, shaken by political instability, and shadowed by the failures of her predecessors. The England she left on the 24th day of March in the year 1603 was steadier, more confident, and culturally luminous in ways few eras before or after could rival. Theatres had flourished. Exploration had expanded horizons. Poetry, music, and learning had blossomed into what later generations would call a golden age. Her name wrapped itself around the century like a mantle, the Elizabethan age. But beyond the victories, beyond the music of lutes and the thunder of cannons, beyond the diplomats and the explorers and the poets, she left something far more delicate, far more human. A reminder, a whisper against the grand narratives history likes to build. That reminder was simple. Even the greatest figures in history are just people. People with hearts that break. People who fear the dark. People who grieve what they cannot fix and regret what they cannot undo. People who get tired, so very tired, no matter how heavy the crown or how bright the throne. Her portraits turned her into a myth. The ageless queen with alabaster skin, fierce eyes, and a spine that refused to bend. They froze her in time as an icon, a symbol of power and brilliance. But the death mask, the cold white plaster that captured her features exactly as they were after her final breath, pulled her back into reality. It showed the truth beneath the legend. Not the eternal youth, not the polished perfection engineered by court artists, not the queen draped in jewels and surrounded by glory, but the woman, a woman who had carried a kingdom long after her strength began to fail. A woman who had pushed her fears so deep that even those closest to her never truly understood them. A woman who clenched her jaw through loneliness, who ruled through heartache, who wore authority like armor until it carved into her bones. The mask revealed what she never allowed the world to see, the exhaustion etched into her mouth, the sorrow folded into the lines around her eyes, the tension that lingered on her brow even in death. It revealed the final truth of her life, a truth she only dared to speak when everything else had fallen away. I am tired. 3 words that held more honesty than all the speeches she made as queen. 3 words that stripped away the gold, the pageantry, the myth. 3 words that belonged not to the monarch, but to the woman beneath the crown. In the dim quiet of Westminster, where her effigy lies carved in softened stone, history and time breathe together. Thousands of visitors pass each year, pausing before the serene marble face created by artists who smoothed away her pain. They admire the monarch, they honor the legend, they marvel at the queen who withstood every storm. But hidden somewhere in an archive, wrapped in cloth and shadow, rests the true face, the unflinching one. The mask that did not flatter, the mask that did not lie, the mask that captured the moment she finally let herself stop fighting. It tells a story no chronicle fully records, that power fades, crowns slip, robes unravel, golden ages dim, and empires shift. And when all the splendor melts away, what remains is the same fragile shape that defines every human life, a soul pressed against the limits of its body, trying to draw one last breath in a world that has grown too heavy for a single heart to bear. That is the Elizabeth time remembers only in whispers, not the myth carved in stone, but the woman whose final gift to history was a truth kings and queens rarely leave behind, that even legends grow weary, and even legends break.